that's the world, that's money. The yoga industry, the yoga community of New York City, partnering with businesses for yoga, but we're trying to do something a little more deep, a little more sincere. And you being a Bhakti yogi yourself, your experience can help people understand.
We tend to separate the different paths of yoga, and especially asana. It's just something that unfortunately has lost what it is intended to really do. Social media aesthetics and lack of attention span. People are too quick to see something and not go deep into understanding what it is. To me, it's about your own state of mind and the intention behind it. And what that is, for me, is a form of prayer.
So Jai Gurudev, Bhagawati Dasi, welcome to the Thinking Bhakti podcast. I'm really happy that you're here.
Jai Gurudev, thank you. I'm really grateful to be here.
Nice. So we're in New York City, you can see. And this is, one of my first few podcasts that I'm doing here in the States, because obviously I had to relocate and do the whole studio again. So we're doing these makeshift setups, but we got a really beautiful backdrop today to have this conversation. And I wanted to talk to you about, first of all, about you, because your first time here. And I always do this. I want people to get to know who you are, how you became who you are today as well, because that journey is often really, really important as well. So I'll ask you some questions along the way. But before we get to the real topic, then who are you, Bhagawati Dasi?
That's a deep question. I can tell you a little bit about my life. So my spiritual name is Bhagawati Dasi, and my birth name is Paula. I was born and raised in Honduras, in the capital of Honduras, Tegucigalpa. And I grew up to a Christian family. I guess the most memorable things for me looking back into my life now are when I was a child. My dad used to read the Bible to us every night. And he prayed next to us. And at the time, some days I enjoyed it, some days I thought it was annoying. But I look back at it and I see how he prayed with a lot of devotion. So that's my fondest memory of childhood. And then growing up in Honduras was very slow, let's say. It's a very slow-paced place. There is not a lot of diversity in Honduras. So growing up there, I didn't interact with different people from different cultures on a regular basis. How I actually learned about the world in my early years was primarily from reading. I loved reading, and my mom loved that I loved reading. So she bought so many books for me when I was young, growing up. And eventually I started to read a lot of classical novels, European novels, primarily some Russian novels. And that's how I began to learn about different religions, different cultures, different traditions. And in some sense, I'd say that allowed me to develop compassion and empathy for people from just different backgrounds, because that's not what I saw in my daily life in Honduras. And aside from that, I had an uncle, great uncle, who had a little library in his house. And I used to visit him and ask him to pull out the encyclopedias. And I was drawn to Eastern spirituality, even though, I didn't know anyone from India as I was a child. But so I asked him about Eastern culture. And he loved reading and loved teaching. So those were also some of my favorite memories growing up. And that's how I began to learn about, let's say, Southeast Asia and India and Eastern traditions. Then I have some other memories that stick out. For example, the first time I saw yoga asana. I have a very vivid memory of this. I was with my mom in our first home. I was maybe around 10 years old, 9, 10. And I was just sitting with her in her living room, and there was a person performing really advanced yoga asana. And I was looking at them with this awe, and she was laughing at them.
Your mom?
Yeah. She was making fun of them, and she was laughing hysterically. Some of these postures can look a little funny.
Right.
And I got angry at her. And I wasn't sure why I was angry, but I was angry at her. And I looked at her and I told her, I asked her, why are you laughing? These are sacred things. And she looked at me and then she laughed even more. But that's the first memory I have of watching yoga asana. Looking back, it could have been a contortionist, but either way, they were actually yoga asana.
So you intuitively knew that it was something sacred. Like you weren't told that he's doing yoga or anything like that.
No, I just had that feeling. And yeah, and then after that, the next time that I actually learned about yoga, because at the time, I'm 36 now, so this was some time ago. Social media wasn't around, Facebook wasn't around. I don't think we even had digital phones at the time. So the knowledge of yoga and meditation wasn't so available. It was quite taboo in Honduras too, to speak about yoga or meditation. People used to think that evil spirits would come to you if you meditated.
It's a very Christian country, right?
Yeah. It's a very Christian country. So the next time I actually really learned about yoga was when I came to the US for university. So my parents sent me to school here, very conservative state in Georgia. But they had, my program had electives, and they had yoga on the electives. So during my sophomore year, choosing my electives, I remember scrolling down and seeing yoga. And I knew I wanted to take this class, and I was excited for it. And I even invited my friends to come take the class. But at the time, they didn't know about it, and they had some strange ideas about what yoga was. So they were making fun of me and said, no, have fun, we're not going, it's hippie, or whatever they were saying. But I went anyways to the class, and I loved it. And I had the blessing, really, that my first yoga asana teacher, I don't remember his name anymore, but he had been to India, and he was quite spiritual, because in that class, it was a vinyasa class, so fast-paced flow. He was also sharing some verses from some of the sacred texts. Looking back, maybe it was the Gita, I don't remember exactly, but it was also a spiritual feeling to the class. And instantly I knew it was going to be a part of my life. So that's, yeah.
When you say that it was like spiritual, obviously my mind immediately goes to, but yoga is spiritual. So I know what you mean, though. I mean, when you perceive someone adding a little extra onto the physical side of things, but was your take at that time, given that you did have that intuition when you were younger, but still was your take that this is more of maybe a physical thing or just a well-being thing, but not a spiritual activity, like inherently yoga?
I guess at the moment I was more so in the flow and not contemplating upon it as much. But the feeling I had from it was that there was something deeper to it, even though it was a 60-minute movement class, right? Vinyasa, fast-paced movements. But I had that understanding that it was not just something physical. I wasn't sure at the time if it was a spiritual practice or what it really was, but I was drawn to it because it made me feel more present, and it just made me feel like it was something important, maybe the most important thing I was doing at the time.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to define what spiritual practice is anyway. I mean, I think sometimes I tend to sort of just broaden it to as long as it's not just bodily focused, and it's already touching spirituality in some sense. Like, not to say that the body can't be, but it has to be that and something else. But something I wanted to ask you about your childhood, though, when I was listening to you, is because you didn't come from a diverse country, and it, being a very Christian country or having one type of way of life, is it a place where you feel like, or maybe it's changed since then, but you feel like those conversations can happen about introducing yoga and bringing it more, sort of to the forefront? Or is it still to this day taboo and just looked at in a bad way?
No, it's changed drastically. So after university, I kept my yoga practice. At first, it was just part of my schedule. I was going to yoga class, and then it slowly became something more important in my life. I'll give you a bit of a longer version to get to the point, but 2011, I graduated university, and I came to New York City for my internship. I worked in jewelry for a few years, and I knew that wasn't what I really wanted to spend my time doing. But during that period of time, I started to have really bad anxiety, even panic attacks. really horrible experiences having a panic attack. And I wasn't really sure why or what was going on, but it was not pleasant. And my parents suggested I visited a psychologist, maybe take medicine, but I just knew that wasn't the solution. I knew that I had to control this through my mind. So a few weeks later, I went to a yoga asana class. I was living in the East Village, and our teacher was chatting with a student about anxiety. And I came to speak with them, and he invited us both to a meditation and pranayama class. So 2012, I started meditating, and I knew that was what was really going to help me. And it did. So after that, I went into this period or phase of my life where I started traveling around the world for about 6 years, still had a base here in New York City. But during that time, I visited Asia for the first time, India, and visited so many temples and started to gain more experience in that sense. And then yoga began to become something different to me. It was something spiritual then, something that I knew was true in whatever sense that made for me at the time.
Was God in the picture?
God was in the picture, but in a more formless aspect. I knew I was being guided. I had that deep feeling since I was a child, really, that I was being guided. But I had a lot of questions that at the time weren't answered to my...
satisfaction?
Yeah, to my satisfaction.
Yeah.
And so after this time, 2018, 10 years after I started practicing yoga first, that year was quite deep for me. I had a few experiences in meditation, and one time I woke up just knowing that my purpose was to share yoga. And it was something that just felt true. I couldn't deny that. So I went back to India to get certified. And after that, I had this feeling that I had to go back to Honduras to share the teachings there. So I did. I went back. I was living at my parents' home at the time. And the only people that were sharing yoga during that period of time were 4 ladies that I knew of, but they were only teaching very privately, nothing public from their homes. It was not advertised. There was still a bit of a taboo there. So I started teaching mostly asana-based classes. And I used my marketing knowledge, which is what I studied in university, and started teaching yoga openly. Started with yoga asana, a lot of skull power yoga, modern practices, which is what I had been training in the most myself. In India, I studied vinyasa and hatha, so I also guided some vinyasa flows. And people loved it. So they began to come into class. My classes were full. I used to teach very challenging yoga asana classes, so even the guys were coming to class. And so things began to change in that respect. Also, social media was out by that moment. And it helped, I think, to at least make the teachings more familiar and approachable to people.
That makes a lot of sense, especially in a space where there isn't already an excess of that. There isn't so much yoga going on, so that when you stand out a little bit more, I mean, it makes sense that you would, benefit from that exposure. So then the next thing I would say, though, is that, okay, you start to do that. What was your parents' take when you come back and you say, my purpose now is to share yoga?
Well, since I started practicing years back, they were familiar with the term. I had been sharing things I had been learning. They were used to my life being less structured than they would like for it to be. So it wasn't much of a surprise then. But they were a bit worried because I guess they just didn't see what future I could have financially through teaching yoga. It was something so new and different to what they know. My parents are doctors and my grandparents are doctors too. So they come from a very different structure in their life. But they were supportive in a sense. At the beginning, of course, I needed financial support, and they gave it to me. Whatever I needed, they actually helped me in that sense. They never came to class or really asked too many questions about it. But in some sense, they were supportive. But in another sense, they were a bit worried. They thought at the beginning it would be another kind of phase for me, that it was something temporary.
I know this is maybe a little bit random, but obviously, the love of a parent can often be just all that's needed for that to happen, for that support to happen. But sometimes I do meet people who are wanting to transition into yoga or things that are unconventional in their family setting. And they sometimes ask me for advice, like, okay, how would you approach your parents, or how have you approached your parents to maybe help make that a little smoother or a little easier? Because, of course, like I said, just depending on the fact that my parents will love me is one thing, but a lot of them feel like I also want to maybe be a little more conscious about how I'm showing up and having those conversations. I mean, is there anything you would advise or say that about your experience that could help someone?
Honestly, I don't think it was anything that I said that helped. It was more so that they saw the continuity of it for me, that it was not something that I was just attached to momentarily, but it was actually something I was passionate about and that I was consistent with. And because I was passionate about it, I did everything that I could to help, grow the community there. And they witnessed that, and they saw how it grew, and they also began to saw, in some sense, changes in my life as well, even though at the time I'd say they were still very subtle. But I'd say that's what really made them trust me in that sense.
And it makes a lot of sense. I mean, that's what the Gita says, in the sense of, like, if you want to inspire or change someone, then just show them your example, not so much about your words. And I often do tell this to people, and they don't like to hear it, because it's a long-term solution. It's not go there, have this conversation, and it's fixed. It's embody what you're doing sincerely. Just be really sincere about what it is you're doing. And if it is of benefit, it will start to bear enough fruits that people witnessing that will go, well, whether I understand it or not, whether I agree with it or not, I can't deny that this person really means it, wants it, and I can see benefit, I can see improvements. And so, I think that's the right formula. Yeah. Appreciate it.
It got to a point where my parents began to see, all these retreats and festivals I was doing, and the amount of people that were coming to the classes and the events, that at one point my dad started to tell his patients maybe they could also practice some yoga.
Well, that's awesome. That's cool.
Yeah.
Now, how did that in the end transition out of Honduras back to, well, I guess here, or how did that happen?
Yeah, so everything was going well, great, actually. And some of my students were inspired to become teachers themselves. Then COVID hit. And
that little thing.
Yeah. So that happened. At the time it happened, I was in an island, and it was nice. I was there for a few weeks. I was on an island with my friends, and then we realized, actually, this might last for a longer time. And I started to have this feeling that I needed to go back to mainland because I would be useful there. So I went back to the mainland, and I was pulled into this more introspective state. And I started to meditate more, and people began to ask for meditation as well. So I started to teach a lot of meditation, study a lot of meditation, and that's what I was doing. I was feeling very spiritually high for a few months after the pandemic started. But then at one point, since I was living at my parents' house, I was around them often, and their conversations were focused on the hospital and what happened during that day in the hospital. And the conversations were very draining for me to listen to, because everything was, around death and fear. And so I needed to leave, but there was nowhere to go at the time. So I just had to wait it out. And finally, the airport in the Honduran islands opened for locals to go, mainland people to go. So I booked my flight. I didn't intend to share with anybody that I was leaving, but I needed a ride to the airport. There were no Ubers around, no taxis around, so I ended up telling my parents, and it didn't go well at all. They were very scared of me going, and healthcare in the islands was not to their comfort. Yeah. And they tried speaking with me about it, but I am very stubborn in some ways, and I said I'm gonna leave, and so we went to sleep. That night before my flight, both of my parents just opened the door to my bedroom at 2 a.m. They barged in, and they were screaming at me, especially my dad, who's very calm normally. He was shouting at me just hysterically, just saying please stay, you're going to die if you go to the islands.
Wow.
What are we going to do if you get sick? Well, you know, he was saying all these things, and I understand where he's coming from. That's what he was seeing in his daily life. And I was, again, fighting back because I had this feeling I had to leave. And then he closed the doors. And in that moment, I thought to myself, maybe this time I should listen to my parents and stay. And I'm always doing what I want. I should be a good daughter. But then I had this experience where I heard a guidance from a man, the voice of a man that said, do not let your actions be ruled by fear. And I knew that I was going to be fine. So I left. And 5 months later, my now husband, Brandon, was visiting these islands for 5 days. And we met during the second day of his visit there. And that's why I'm back in New York City, because he's from here and things evolved.
Amazing, amazing.
Yeah.
Do you feel like that guidance that you got was it like a thing that had occurred before? Was it the first time that something like that happened to you?
It actually happened once before in 2016. I was traveling around Europe by myself for 2 months. And at one point I was in Germany. I was just visiting friends. That whole trip was around cultural experiences, some hiking, having fun. I was in Berlin, and then I was going to go visit some other friends in Vienna. So at the moment, I decided to just travel by bus that time. So I took a bus, and this bus stopped in Frankfurt. And if I have a choice, I usually sit next to the window. So I sat next to the window. The bus pulls up in the Frankfurt bus stop or station, and I see these people wearing the tilak and wearing long dresses and just different looking people. And some of them came into the bus because this bus stopped in a few places. And one of them sat next to me. And so I started chatting with them and asked them questions. And eventually they shared with me they were devotees and they live in an ashram just outside of Frankfurt with their guru. And even though I had been practicing yoga, I really hadn't heard these terms, or if I had, they were maybe just fleeting.
Yeah.
So I asked them to explain what all of these things were. And eventually I asked them, can I see a photo of your guru? And they showed me a photo of Paramahamsa Vishwananda. And I remembered feeling I wanted to go meet him, 2016. And nothing was really stopping me. Like I could have gone. I was tripped that I just didn't have any set schedule or plans. And so I was trying to figure out how to get there. And the bus at that point, had already taken off from the Frankfurt bus station. And as I was figuring out how I could go to this ashram, I had this voice come to me and said, and that moment it said, not right now, you're going to come back. So it had happened those times that I can recall very clearly. And again, that I knew that was what I had to do in that moment. And so I let it go at that time.
I think it takes a lot, how to put this? Yeah, in one way to recognize the guidance, but in another one also to just implicitly trust it, because, I mean, where is it coming from in some sense? Of course, if I start to hear some clear guidance inside of me, I maybe I would trust that it comes from a good source, but I especially for someone who's stubborn, like you said, I think I would try to reason with it, or at least try to see okay, but is there any evidence for this? Like, why should I not do this now? Why should I do it then? A lot of people go through these things in their head, and it's not, they're not great at listening to even external guidance when it comes from their guru. So internally getting some kind of guidance and then following it can be special, tough, special. I mean, both of those things at the same time. My mother, when I spoke with her, she shared some moments in her life where she had those kind of clear moments, and I have such an appreciation and respect for people who are able to really listen to that and do it, because it's, to put it bluntly, not easy. It's not easy to listen to your own, mind's voice. To listen to another voice inside of you is even harder in many ways, and so I think it's both commendable and at the same time also so nice to see more and more cases where it's so clear that the divine looks after us, even in non-obvious ways, because it's not a showing off. It's not that divinity came to you in a name and form and said, I am this person looking after you and saying this, and that. It's more just a little nudge in this direction or a nudge in that direction. My question is, those guidances, both of them, did you have an intuition of who or what they were coming from? Did you attribute it to God, or what was it?
The only thing I know for certain is that that guidance was the truth. I didn't know if it was a higher spiritual being or if it was a direct message from God. I had no idea. I just knew that it was the truth and it wasn't coming from me. Those were the two times that I very clearly had that guidance. And I am now, I wouldn't go back a year back or 5 years back, because I'm happy where I am right now. So I feel
good
like
guidance.
Yeah.
Well, before I move to another point, though, I want to shout out to the Sri Pitani Laya Street Kirtan team for catching people's attention and giving them answers. So you're in New York. You obviously at that point you're with Brandon. You are still in this yoga pursuit in some sense. I mean, the Bhagawati Dasi that I met, full-blown yoga teacher, right? How did that happen? Let's say this, that New York side of things now to like ramp up, I guess, your role as a yoga teacher. Would you identify yourself as something different than that, just a yoga teacher, or you see it differently?
No,
that's correct, right? So how did that happen for you, like that second stint in New York, I guess?
Well, I think it was just a result of everything that I was doing before. And I started to share my life as well at the same time as I was starting to teach and learn. I started to share on social media. And people began to connect with what I was sharing, whether it was physical aspect of it, or sometimes I shared a lot of inspiring quotes that I read myself that inspired me. I like to write on my posts too. So for whatever reasons, people began to resonate with what I was sharing. And the community started to grow in that sense. So when I moved to New York City, I had already been sharing my life for several years, since 2018, focused on yoga teachings. And so things kind of happened organically, really. I started with content creation, I would say. At that moment, Instagram was very popular. Ads on Instagram were gaining interest in large companies too. People were shifting from older sources or ways of marketing to using micro-influencers and to promoting online and via ads. So I was being contacted by several companies, and a lot of them were actually quite famous and recognized. And my filter was just, what kind of proposal was it? So I always want to share things that are inspiring for people, that will help people live a better life, that things that resonate with me. If it's products that support the environment, that have eco-friendly practices or support communities. So, and a lot of companies actually are focused in those directions now. So it started happening quite organically in that sense. And then I had my work permit come after, Brandon and I were married, and then I started to teach more freely here. And that meant for me that I was teaching in person, because a lot of what I was doing before was online, or I traveled to other places to teach in other places too. And so that opened a lot of doors as well. Yeah. And that opened the doors to actually connecting with the local community too, which the only other time I had really done that was in Honduras while I was living there.
Right. I mean, I can imagine the New York City community and the Honduras community being a little different, but in spirit, I guess, the same. But this is a perfect segue to a couple of things that I think we have to touch on. I mean, one, you had that guidance, not yet, but eventually you did meet Paramahamsa Vishwananda, because that's why we're here, and that's why you're called Bhagawati Dasi.
Yeah.
So how that happened and how that came about and what that has changed. But the second thing is a lot of what you just mentioned. So teaching yoga in the city, partnering with, commercial companies, partnering with whatever it is. A lot of people struggle to marry those things with sincere spirituality, with a bhakti-based path, so about service and humility and love for God. And I think a lot of people struggle to marry those things in a healthy way and to think that it's compatible. I see, not that it gets articulated very much. I haven't met people who give you very concrete reasons of why not, other than just sort of low resolution stuff like capitalist nonsense, whatever. It's more that almost intuitively, silently, the unspoken stuff, people think, that's the world, that's money, that's business, that's yoga, the industry of yoga, which is primarily just, asanas, fashion, lifestyle. But we're trying to do something a little more deep, a little more sincere. And so they just make this simplistic split. We can't get involved in that stuff because that represents all of the superficial, non-sincere stuff. And I'm trying to do something more serious, therefore. And I think that what I've witnessed from you and being around you and what you're sharing is that you do navigate both of those things at the same time. And so what I'm curious is that if you even see that split or how you do it. I mean, you mentioned about checking the offers and seeing if it makes sense for you. But I think even beyond that, just the overarching idea of the yoga industry, the yoga community of New York City, partnering with businesses for yoga, and you being a bhakti yogi yourself, for having a guru, being an initiate, all of these things, like, so again, starting with the Guruji part, and then I've asked a lot here, but how we transition into that, because I think that's really the crux of what I think your experience can help people understand. So
I moved back to New York around 2021 or so, and by that point, Brandon and I had been dating for 1 year, and the next year, something shifted where I just started to go into this phase that I look back and I call a period of the desert, because it felt like being in the desert. Like I was put out in a desert with no water and no oasis around me, and it just felt very dry internally. Even though outside everything was fabulous. We were traveling a lot, work was going well, we were healthy, family was fine. We lived here in New York City in the Upper East Side, but at the same time, it just felt very dry. And the anxiety was coming back, and it was coming back very intensely, to the point that it was hard for me to even get on the subway station to commute, to get from one place to another. Often I jumped out before I arrived just because I was feeling anxious and I had to get some fresh air. And nothing I was doing seemed to be making that better. And again, I didn't want to take any medicine because I knew I had to just control it with my own mind, even though it was probably the roughest time I've experienced in my life. And Brandon had no idea what was going on. And coping mechanisms I was using at the time were actually quite a lot of asana. So I used a lot of grounding postures. Sometimes I woke up at night and I had to lay down in child pose. Sometimes I just did very long shavasana, or I had to do a flow to move some energy around. And so I'm very grateful that I had a knowledge of yoga during those moments, because it was really the only thing that helped me in some way.
Yeah.
But this kept going for, I think, even a little over a year. And at one point, I started to pray more. And again, God was in my life, present in my life in more of a kind of formless way. So I used to pray to the divine. Sometimes I called it the universe. Sometimes I called it the Divine Mother. And I just started to pray just for courage and guidance. And during that moment, teachers from the path of Bhakti Yoga began to come into my life. So how it really started is, again, during, that period of time, internally, a lot of things were shifting. And one thing that was very evident was that a lot of my tastes had changed, sort of from day to night. I just wanted to do only spiritual things. And that included the centers I visited here. So for my birthday, one of the things Brandon did was he put together a list of all of the traditional yoga centers or spiritual centers that he could find in the area. And I loved that. So at one point we were traveling in Europe and we were walking down a neighborhood in Madrid, and I see Shivananda, and I recognized it from that list. So I walk in and there was music playing, and it was kirtan. I didn't know at the time what it really was, but it was kirtan, and I sat down and I cried the whole time. And then I connected with that teacher, and he gave me a mala, and he also eventually shared with me a Bhagavad Gita, connected with him for a few months, and that started to feel like some water came to me. Then this teacher who lived in Vrindavan, he, I guess, wanted me to take a bit of a deeper commitment on that path of yoga, but I didn't feel that pull from within me that felt like that was my home. So I didn't continue studying with him. Then some months later, I met another teacher from the Path of Bhakti. She lives in Miami, and she's very sweet. And again, I learned some other things from her. She has a center in Miami, so I visited, and I started to learn more of the relationship with the deities through her. And again, at one point, she asked me if I wanted to go deeper in the path, but I didn't feel like that was my home either. So I said no, but these things were beginning to feel like water to me. And I spent days sometimes listening to kirtan, and that's all that I did. I started chanting lots of mantras. I had been familiar with mantra before from my yoga studies, more of in, not in kirtan, but just prayers and mantras. And eventually, another moment of these kind of deep guidances happened where Brandon had a work trip. And I was tagging along. We had everything booked. Actually, he had just called the Uber, and we were about to leave the apartment, open the door, and get on the Uber to go to the airport. And in that moment, when he opened the door, I had this very strong, and just in that moment, I didn't hear a voice, but I had this strong intuition that I had to stay. And I wasn't sure why, but I just knew I had to stay. So I told him I can't go. He had his bag in his hand, and he was very upset. He was tired of whatever I was doing for that year that didn't make sense to him. But
Brandon's a pretty structured guy. Yeah.
But I stayed, and he left to the airport, and I sat down in child pose again. I laid in child pose. I was crying, and at one point I said, okay, well, I need to figure out why I had to stay. So I said, I'm going to meditate, and I want to do it in a group this time, so maybe I'll have some clarity later. So I looked at this list, and I found a place called the Om Center that's very close to our apartment. So I go. She was guiding a sound bath, which I actually had not tried to that point. And it was really nice. It felt nice. And after the sound bath, I chatted with the people there and became good friends with two guys from Dubai who are now devotees of Guruji as well. And at that point, we connected because we were both just really enjoying talking about yoga philosophy. So we spent lots of days just reading books together, discussing these concepts. And eventually, a few months later, I was on a trip, and he messaged me. And he said, I met a Swami at the Om Center that I think you would enjoy his teachings. So he shared the handle with me, and it was Swami Chidananda. And as I was scrolling through his feed, I felt there was something different from his energy than any other teachers I had met at the time. So we connected on Instagram, and he reached out, and he mentioned they have an ashram upstate New York in Elmira. And I felt I wanted to come visit. At the time, he was traveling, and so was I. Christmas came, and I was traveling too. And when we came back, both of us were back in New York. I went to the ashram in February, beginning of February, by myself, because no one else wanted to come with me at the time. And it was a blessing to be by myself there, because I feel I was just really present. It helped me to be more present there. And he initiated me into Atma Kriya Yoga. And I remember when I visited the ashram that very first time, I perceived this fragrance that it's just the most amazing fragrance I have smelled. And I kept asking, where is this incense? I want to buy this incense. And people were kind of avoiding the question and just said, oh, I don't know, maybe it's this or who knows. But there was this fragrance that I was really drawn to. And being there felt like home to me. And I enjoyed the prayers. I enjoyed the people that were there. It was a very small sangha at the time. And yeah, that was my first time at the ashram, and it just felt like home. And I saw photos of Mahavatar Babaji and of Guruji there, Paramahamsa Vishwananda. And shortly after, I brought a photo with me, by the way. And when I came to the city, I sat it next to the bed, and Brandon started asking questions.
Why is there a picture of another man next to us now?
Yeah. But I wasn't sure actually how I felt at the time. It just felt familiar, and I wanted to keep him close to me. At one point, I had to hide the photo. So I hid the photo, but I knew where it was, and I always saw it every day. And I read the quote that was at the bottom of the photo. And then I read on an email he was giving online darshan at the time. And I wasn't sure what that really was, but I signed up. And I had to wake up at 3 a.m. New York time. I don't know where he was at that moment. There were 1,000 people in the online darshan, and I sat through the whole thing. I had a feeling that I felt like when he looked at me. I had a feeling of when he looked at me. But that was that. I went back to sleep. And after that, everything kept kind of deepening in that sense. My connection with him, he came into my dreams, and I started to perceive that fragrance in other places too. And then he came to the US for the inauguration of the temple 2023. And that's when I first met him in person. And at the time, I didn't have any questions. I just knew.
What did you know?
Cut.
It's the best part, you know? So I'll skip that question.
Okay. No, don't skip it. Okay. I'm fine.
Yeah. So, what is it that you knew when you met Guruji for the first time? What is it that you felt?
The only thing that was clear to me then was that he was the one who had been guiding me and who has been guiding me, and he's the person I had to serve. It just felt like that was the reason why I was here in this earth, in this body, in this lifetime. And I wasn't sure, and still I'm not, of how that really makes sense. But it's just the feeling that I have.
And do you feel like that came to you literally the day or moment that you met him?
No, I think it was a few months back when he began to come into my dreams, and I began to experience him there. Yeah, I think that's when it became very clear to me.
I mean, look, the only reason I ask is because I know what that is. I know what that feels like personally. And I've seen it a lot in people. And I love it personally because it's the real deal. It's when something hits you so undeniably, and it's the exact reason that you can't explain it that makes it that much more real. Because if it was a logical thing, oh, okay, this happened, this was said, I would get this benefit out of it or whatever, then you can start to see a logical pathway to why you feel like this is the new, course of your life. But I think it's one of those things where it often doesn't make sense, or it's often inconvenient or irrational in some sense. I'm sure Brandon thought that it was.
Yeah.
But it's this feeling of like, at the same time, it's so abundantly clear, and it comes from a space that is, for want of a better expression, deeper. It's just deeper, a more real part of yourself, or a more profound part of yourself, and those
Yeah.
things are the undeniable moments that make us change the lives that we live. And I've seen that. I try to explain it, I try to put it into philosophy or put it into writing or put it into a podcast, but
Yeah.
I often tell people, if I could just go like this and show you the contents of my heart, we'd be,
Like Hanuman.
yeah, that's the only way to really do it. But I know what you mean, and I think those are the beautiful moments to share, because someone will hear that, and it can really help them make sense of what doesn't make sense, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, when I met him, the desert was no longer there.
The anxiety never came back.
Well, it was not necessarily referring to the anxiety, but to the feeling of dryness inside.
Right.
It was just gone. It's like I found the fountain of water.
Yeah, I can resonate with that. I
Yeah,
know what that
and
is.
the anxiety has gone, I'd say maybe 98%. I feel like there are some traces there, but every time I chant his name, it doesn't affect me. The anxiety doesn't affect me.
It anchors you in some way.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think, well, one thing I'd like to know is that after you had seen that situation in Germany,
Yeah.
and not yet, what was the first time that you saw his face again after
Yeah.
that?
So actually, that happened in Germany, and now that memory is very clear to me, but it was erased for a period of time. It was just not something I remembered until close to when I met him in person again, and that memory came back.
Was it after you met Swami Chidananda?
It was after I met Swami Chidananda.
Right.
Yeah.
And then you saw the picture again, and then you remembered that that's the same guy
Yeah.
from... Right.
I don't know that it was really the picture that made me remember that again, as much as maybe that feeling that I had. Yeah.
Amazing. So then, I mean, fast forwarding, I mean, you do meet Guruji at the inauguration of the temple, 2023.
Yeah.
From then till now, well, you know, just over 2 years since then, you've become his devotee, you've become an initiate, you're part of the community of Guruji and Bhakti Marga here in New York City and America in general. You've traveled to his ashram in Germany and all over the world. What has that been like for you? That change these last 2 years in comparison to what it was before? I mean, apart from the desert
Yeah.
being fixed, but just, you know, practically speaking, how's that been different for you?
Life has changed in every way. And it's this year, for example, we've had the chance to travel and meet him in so many places, and how that has impacted me personally is I feel like I have this clarity of whatever I've learned in the past, and how now I can really share from a space of service and something that's more real and something that's anchored in something that's bigger than ourselves. I feel like that's what he's helping me to really understand, is that whatever I have learned, I should share, not because I want to gain something from it, but ultimately to share his teachings through every single pathway that I've learned. So that's where your second question comes in.
Right.
And yeah, often, you know, we tend to separate the different paths of yoga, and especially asana. You know, now it's just something that unfortunately has lost what it is intended to really do. I'd say primarily because of, you know, social media aesthetics and lack of attention span. People are too quick to see something and not go deep into understanding what it is. Mm-hmm. But in that sense, these years with Guruji and developing this bhakti and understanding my relationship to God more clearly and my service to the world, it's also become clear to me that asana, just as much as meditation and anything else that I practice and that I can teach, are also pathways to opening that door that is something filled with love and something that's deeper. It's to awaken ultimately that knowledge of who we are. In the beginning, that we know, you know, in written records, in the Vedas, for instance, there was no mention of asana. Asana was just mentioned not as a physical posture, but just to refer to as a seat. But then we begin to see the mention of asana, which was always attached to the purpose of meditation in the beginning of what we know. So, for instance, in the classical period with Patanjali Yoga Sutras, he begins to speak about asana just in one of the verses that he has, Stiram Sukham Asanam, which means that the asana has to be a relaxed or comfortable pose. And the whole purpose is also for meditation. And why meditation? Ultimately, to understand who we are, the truth of the self, and then to understand the relationship between the self and God. And later, more postures were mentioned in the Hatha Yoga Pradipika and in the classical or tantric period as well, medieval tantra. And that's when we really begin to see asana as we know it now. 15 to 34 asana were shared during that period of time, mainly by the Shaivites, because they were practicing Tantra. Tantra is a pathway to connecting with God ultimately as well. And so a lot of these postures were there to help us awaken the Kundalini, or to use these practices to help us awaken ultimately to that inner wisdom. And after that, and in the modern period, we have the postures that we are more familiar with now, the longer sequences, starting with Krishnamacharya from Mysore. It's when Brandon and I visited Mysore a few years ago. I studied there with my teacher who had studied with BKS Iyengar, for instance. So a lot of the modern practices of asana that we know of come from Krishnamacharya. And he was teaching Hatha Yoga. And from Hatha Yoga, Ashtanga came. He developed a sequence of Ashtanga because the royal palace asked him to create something different for the military, actually. They wanted something more challenging. So he created a series of Ashtanga, and he also taught BKS Iyengar and Patabi Joyce, who later developed the primary and secondary series of asana through Ashtanga, and BKS Iyengar with Iyengar Yoga, which came influenced by his teachings, but then also he had an accident. So he knew that we can still reap the benefits of the asana no matter what physical condition we have, using the props. But ultimately, it's all to awaken the flow of divine energy within the Shakti, the Kundalini, so that we can remember who we are and we can remember God. So now for me, the practice of asana is really a form of prayer. That's how I feel when I practice. When I practice by myself or when I go to studios, even if it's a power yoga class or whatever kind of asana it is, to me, it's about your own state of mind and the intention behind it. And what that is, for me, is a form of prayer. And I do find a lot of value in the asana in that sense that it helps us to kind of move the energy around so that ultimately we return to a state of more inner harmony, because that's when we have clarity of mind.
I couldn't agree more. I think one of the things that you've said that I want to just highlight for a second, in the Patanjali era of yoga, the idea of asana is to facilitate something else, in that case, to facilitate meditation. But that's another word for service, like one thing serves another, right? And there can be a symbiotic relationship in that respect. And so one of the things that I often advise people when it comes to transitioning from whatever walk of life they're in, let's say it is, asana-based yoga, or it is, alternative medicines or whatever it may be, and people come into Bhakti Yoga, they come into a personal relationship with God. And on these paths, there can be, as I said, some resistance or some difficulty to make them synthesize well. And so they feel like they need to just discard that and move on from it into something else. They might hold some respect for it as like, oh, it was an important phase of my life. But what I've seen is that you haven't nearly changed. You've changed on one side completely, but what you do hasn't changed, but maybe why and how. And so that is something that I think really needs to be heard by people, which is maybe the reasons why you do that asana, or the reason why you teach, and the intent and the framework and almost like the ethic behind it is what really starts to adapt and change when you get this bigger picture. Because it's one thing to sit and tell someone, here's an asana for you, it will help you feel better in your body. Here's an asana, it's going to facilitate your journey towards knowing yourself and relating with God. Of course, you have to show them how. You have to, in a sense, give them a roadmap. But actually then the activity you're doing is teaching asana. That hasn't changed. But the intent behind it, the framework, is completely different. And I think from what I'm seeing in your life and what I'm hearing from you as well, I think this is what a lot of people need to understand, that it's not a question of dismissing what you're doing or getting rid of it. In the case of yoga, you're even, in a sense, making the point that it's not a new thing. It's returning to almost an original intent.
Yeah, that's how I see it, really. And there was a phase, a few months maybe, where I had a bit of a resistance to the practice of asana when I first started to, study with Bhakti Marga.
Yeah.
Because the focus is on leelas of God, learning more about God, the rituals, the practices from Bhakti Marga itself. So that resistance was there for some time. But then it just became clear to me, and in some sense it's like my body needed the asana as well, because it's just something that has been so helpful in my life. And it became clear to me too that it's actually, it can be also a yagna, an offering to my guru and just to the divine. And a lot of the postures as well actually were created based off of some stories of the divine or leelas. So as you said, it's just now, modern time, unfortunately, that knowledge that the postures were originally intended for that deeper connection is in a sense lost. But it's nothing really new. And for me in my life, it just makes complete sense to practice them and teach them. But again, the intention behind my practice and my teachings are ultimately to inspire people to awaken to the inner knowing of God.
I think that I agree with you 100%. I think the issue is what I've seen often as well is that a lot of people want to reap the benefits of yoga, but they don't necessarily want to adopt the full picture, because the God that yoga is designed to help you connect with may appear to be a foreign God to them, or a foreign concept of God.
Yeah.
I think in truth, at the essence, it's not, but it can definitely appear that way, and it's difficult for people to reconcile these things. And so they're like, look, why don't you strip away that extra stuff? Because the benefits that can be derived from yoga away from that are also obvious and clear. It's hard to deny them. And so I think a lot of that has happened. And maybe then a lot of the dialogue that needs to happen is not only about this, different intentionality and returning to an original idea, but I'm curious to hear, do you ever bring in philosophy or knowledge or ideas or trading sort of thoughts about how you can ultimately incorporate something like this back into a framework of divinity or of self that transcends those religious walls and barriers a little bit? Have you encountered those kind of situations?
Yeah, I have. There have been several instances when people just ask me if practicing asana will make them Hindu, or some people think it's Buddhist, so they ask, will it make me Buddhist? So that ignorance is there. Ultimately, I think the knowledge is something that can help us to understand what it truly is, but ultimately it's just a matter of shifting one's perspective and really understanding that God is not something limited, and that God is and will always be infinite. And that means that there are infinite ways to connecting with God as well. So something that I've found helpful for myself and also some of my students is understanding why we do certain things, not just in yoga asana, but everything else as well, like the meditations or some of the rituals, the mantras. But for instance, with asana, understanding the asana, even if whoever is practicing or teaching does not feel that divine connection at first, understanding the asana just brings so much depth to it. For example, like Hanumanasana, which is full split pose, is there because of it's modeled after the Leela where Hanuman takes that leap from South India into Sri Lanka in service of Ram. So it's an asana that represents service and the devotion to the teacher. So knowing that, someone can practice Hanumanasana and maybe connect to that meaning with it in however that way that expresses in their lives at that time. Other postures like Natarajasana, which means dancer pose. It's modeled after Shiva's cosmic dance and represents just beautiful concept of the cycle in which we all live, the creation, the dissolution, the destruction, the maintenance, and the awakening, the moksha, and the ignorance, the maya. All of that is represented in that pose, the Natarajasana. And it's beautiful because it's both dynamic. You're holding your foot up in the back and the other arm is extended forward. So it also is a very harmonious posture that represents that inner harmony that teaches us ultimately that no matter what is happening in our life, we have that power to remain in harmony and in balance. And like this, different asanas share so much knowledge that is independent of what form of the divine you connect with. Like Garudasana or the eagle pose. Another beautiful standing balance pose. Again, it's after Garuda, which is Vishnu's vehicle.
Right.
And well, the eagle is very symbolic by itself, but again, it symbolizes most strongly protection. And that knowing that no matter what we are going through, we are always protected. So something that's important for me is that just taking the time to actually understand what you're doing and not just doing things because it's trendy or because you want to work out of it. And that way, you just get more benefit from it.
And do you feel like you've been having success in doing that with people, teaching them that?
With my private students, yes. Right now, it's different dynamic as well. It's much harder to have that much, time to explain the different things if you're teaching in a group as it is when you have private lessons. But even in group classes, I do mention a lot of things that I've just have resonated with me or quotes from different texts, or sometimes I explain the asana. It has to be quick depending on the class, the postures move quickly. But I always have that element there in whatever I'm teaching. Yeah.
I think it's really important. I can only encourage people to really sort of dive into that side of things as well. There was something else you said. I really don't want to miss it before we would wrap up or anything, but you said that at some point you got discouraged a little bit from the practices while you were diving into the Bhakti Marga's teachings. I'd like to offer sort of an interpretation from my side. Tell me if it resonates or makes sense. I think one of the reasons where people don't understand sometimes what is going on to them in these moments, and then they feel it that way, like, oh, I'm unmotivated or discouraged, is that the hierarchies of what's important have shifted, and we're not necessarily aware of that. So Yogasana, for example, might be really up here in my life, and then I just find something greater, and so it appears to have dropped. But it's not that it's dropped, it's still up here, but just something's gone even higher up. Yeah. And when those hierarchy shifts happen, I think what often I see in people is they seem to just care about what's in number one and start to dismiss a little bit the rest of the ladder. And I think it's just making peace with a new reality, which is this is still important to me. This is still very valuable to me. And you mentioned the word help. These things help. I've encountered a lot of narrow-mindedness in Vaishnava traditions, in Bhakti traditions, because of exactly this issue. There's a hierarchy of, let's say, deities. Yeah, and let's say Krishna or Narayana sit at the top of that hierarchy in our philosophical framework. And then you have a figure like Shiva or the Divine Mother or whoever, and you go, well, since they're not sitting on top of that hierarchy, I won't engage with them. I'm not going to pray, or I'm not going to worship or read about them or associate with them in some form or another. And I mean, the rationale is clear. They're not number one. I'm only interested in what's most important. But in doing so, I think one of the big criticisms I would have to that is that you rob yourself from all of the help all of the example, all of the inspiration, all of the great association that you can have from continuing your connection with those things, but now in a clarity that they're just not number one. But that doesn't make 2, 3, and 4 meaningless, worthless, to be discarded. And I think yogasana is not number one. I don't think it has ever been sort of meant to be number one. Your connection to self and God are more important. And as Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita, Bhakti Yoga is the primary means for that. In order to achieve that, practice your Bhakti Yoga. But I believe that can be a symbiotic thing, as I said earlier, meaning your yogasana takes a lower priority, but it doesn't get thrown out or dismissed. And then that number one priority, which is your Bhakti Yoga, actually becomes infused into that asana practice, because they help each other, and the asana practice is then done to further facilitate your Bhakti Yoga. And I think that kind of way of looking at a hierarchy as do all of them, but the lower rungs in service to the higher one, and the higher one like permeating through the lower ones, is really what it's meant to be. And a lot of people just say, well, whatever's number one is what I do, and I dismiss all the rest. And I think that's a big problem.
Yeah, I agree. And at one point, I felt like that myself. But what I found is that just creates a bigger limitation or a bigger wall in my experience of love. Because whenever you create a wall or dismiss something or see something as less, then automatically your ability to feel that love and to embody love is also limited. And whatever we have resistance to is, again, another wall. So at one point, I just realized that that's what I was doing to myself. And no one had said not to do these things or to avoid doing the asana and only focus on these practices. It was just something that I myself did for whatever reason. But my learning from that was exactly that by avoiding to do what I know has helped me so much to come to the point where I am now, my relationship with God and Guruji, was not the answer, really. And understanding, not just from the asana, but actually that whatever we are doing, whatever we're engaging in, wherever we are, whoever we're speaking with, whether they are in the knowing of God or not, if we have any kind of limitation to that in our mind, that it is not as important, then it just limits our ability to love. And that's how it was for me. And that's, I think, also one of the reasons of why the anxiety has lessened so much is because I've come to terms with being okay and happy, or trying to be okay and happy with whatever is going on around me. And knowing that in that moment, I can still connect with God, no matter what's happening.
I have a question for you.
Yeah.
What would you say to someone who is in that desert right now? Because I've, whether they phrase it that way or not, but I've met a lot of people over the years, and I'm sure there's a lot more people online who feel that way. They're in that desert, as you described it. Maybe things outside are fine, but inside they're not. You've been there, you're out of it. What would you say to someone who's in there?
I would say that's a good place to be, because the moon only shines the brightest in the darkest place. And it's the same with our spiritual life. Whenever you are in these deserts or dark nights, that's when we have the chance to actually distinguish with more clarity what is truly valuable and what brings us that happiness, what is that light, who God is. So in the moment that one is traveling through the desert, I just suggest what helped me in that moment was to pray, and to pray to whatever form of the divine you connect with in that moment.
Are your parents happy with the life you have now?
They are. My dad actually came to meet Guruji a few months ago in Miami, and my mom still has questions. But in terms of just seeing me and how I am, they're very grateful. Now the changes are very noticeable to them, and trust me, they're really happy. They're grateful. It's impacted their lives as well. So it's all good.
And how about Brandon?
Brandon became a devotee this year as well.
Yeah, I think it's really nice to sort of plant those flags there, you know, like we had those challenges, family, understanding, not understanding, husband, understanding, not understanding.
Yeah.
And now further down the road with that consistency, showing up with sincerity, both of those situations have changed. You're in a better place. You've gone beyond issue A, which was the desert anxiety issue, has decreased tremendously. And you're still the same Bhagawati Dasi in many ways, the same Paula, however, with these extras on top, you know, doing things in a more profound way.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for sharing everything. If people want to reach out to you, you know, be a part of what you're doing, what should they do?
I think easiest thing would be connect through Instagram, Bhagawati Dasi, and just send me a message. I read all of my messages. Sometimes it takes me a few days, but I try to respond to everyone. And yeah.
And you know, I can say also that you've been a great, great pillar and help in everything that Bhakti Marg is doing in America, in New York, in Miami, in other spaces as well. And so, you know, to connect with you, they can come to Bhakti Marg events, they can come to your own events, your own courses and classes. You do your private classes as well, right? So all of that, I highly recommend. So thank you so much. It was a pleasure to talk to you. I hope to do this again, maybe one time with Brandon, hear his side of the story.
That would be fun.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Bhagawati Dasi. Jai Gurudev.
Jai Gurudev.